Hey there, Matty Matt here. Today we are going to be lettering in glyphs. This is what we've got going on today. I've got a sketch that I'm going to be working from, and I'm going to sort of bring you through glyphs and sort of show you how I use it, what I like about it, how I think it can sort of speed up the process. So this is the sketch I'm sort of working from here, this little cutie sketch. I sort of chose this just to make it to where it wasn't focused on individual letter forms, instead it was an actual lettering piece, so you can sort of see how things are working. I avoided something monoline because I didn't want to sort of get into how to work on a monoline script at the moment, and just sort of be able to showcase a few different aspects that I like. So we're going to go through just the general vector process and also sort of showcase some plugins that I use, and also touch on just shortcuts and things like that, and sort of the precision control and why I use glyphs for most of my vectoring now. So to get started, I'm going to set up a little text edit document here. The reason I'm going to do this is I'm going to sort of take notes along the way, just so I can highlight things just points that I talk about. That way you don't necessarily have to take notes as I go. I'll try to write down some shortcuts that I use, list some plugins. So we can just start right now with a plugins list, and I'll add to this as we get going. Cool. And we'll start I guess I should start a shortcuts because that will be more important in the beginning. Just so you know exactly what I'm doing, and I'll be sure to highlight those along the way. So I'm going to set this up over here, and then we'll start getting into glyphs. So let me get over to glyphs now. This is what you're sort of presented with glyphs. This is a type design software. That's what it's intended for, but I think the vectoring controls are really nice, and that's why I do a lot of lettering in it. So we're not going to be breaking things into individual letters. Instead, I'm going to be just building everything inside of it, what would normally be a single glyph. So just to keep things simple, we'll just open up capital A, since that's at the very beginning of the alphabet up there. And to get going, I already had a sketch, so I can bring that directly into glyphs. To do that, I go up to glyphs up here, or up to glyph, and hit add image. I've already sort of got my destination selected here, and from there I can just select my image, bring it in. You can see it throws it up in here. And let me bring back our shortcuts and plugins list here, just so we can have that handy as we go. So I have my image in here, and it's a bit larger than what I need. Right here I have my baseline, my X height, cap height, A center line, and at the bottom a D center line. Those aren't necessarily coming into play since we're not actually building out a typeface, but they're good to be wary of, just because you get a preview down on the bottom here of what you're working on if you actually have it toggled on. And if I were to letter this at this scale right now, it would sort of bleed off of this little preview section and sort of defeat the purpose of having that. I like having this here because you get to see what you're doing at a smaller scale. You'll be able to adjust it later on, and it just gives you a better glimpse of what exactly you're doing. So I'm just going to rescale this here, and if you don't have your bounding box visible on your image, you can enable that by going to View and Show Bounding Box. And it's Shift, what is this? Shift+Command+B? Option+Command+B? Yes, Shift+Option+Command+B. I toggle that on and off, so that might be happening a few times. And so I'll make a note of that here. And this is bounding box. Enable bounding box. We'll do Shift plus Option plus Command B. Cool. So Shift+Option+Command+B gives you your bounding box. As you can see, toggling it on and off. And I'm gonna sort of be a little loose with how I have this. I'm gonna have it just dip beneath the X or the baseline and sort of go above the cap height. Again, it doesn't really matter too much. Just sort of keeping it within my ascender and descender. And I'm gonna save this file just so we don't lose anything just in case. So great, so I have my sketch in here. I can right click on this and lock my image. And over here I'm gonna just start another section just for general things. So this will be shortcuts and tricks. This will be just general notes. This will probably be the most helpful, the shortcuts and tricks. Notes will be just sort of general things I make note of along the way. And the plugins are sort of, I'm putting the least emphasis on just because they aren't something you absolutely need, but they can really come in handy later and just really speed things up. So in the notes section, what I'm going to put here is that if you right click on the image, you can lock it or unlock it. So right click to lock image. Great, so we have this locked. Meaning I can't accidentally move it around. And so I'm going to go in here now and just sort of quickly vector through things. And with Illustrator, it sort of works the same way. You click and drag, you get a handle. But in Glyphs, if you click and drag and then your next point doesn't have a handle as well, it won't sort of enable you to create that curve. The point being is that whenever you are creating handles in Glyphs, they sort of force you to have two handles on both points. Illustrator, you don't necessarily have to do that. Glyphs forces you to do it because mathematically that's sort of how things work. And in Illustrator, they actually sort of create an invisible point for you, or an invisible handle, that is. So as I go through here, I'm just going to sort of rough in very quickly where all of my extreme points are, and that's sort of like the verticals and horizontals, as you can see here. And you'll notice sort of in these corner sections that I'm going to add a little overlap. That's just, it'll give me a little bit greater control later on. So I've gone through and sort of roughed in everything. As you can see, I'm starting to get a preview down here. I haven't done absolutely everything. I still have the sort of crossbar and the T and the tittle, but I can get to those later. Just to sort of get myself started, I've got this very rough view over here. And if I hold the space bar down, you'll notice that I get a live preview of this. And as you hold spacebar, similar to in Illustrator, you can click and drag around to get around your work area. And so I'll add that in here as well. Spacebar to preview and move around. So now we can go through and sort of start to refine a few things, and then I'll be able to start to highlight aspects that I like and sort of get to showcase a bit more of the robustness of Glyphs, and despite its simple features. So a few things I want to point out first are the differences between sort of these blue and green anchors here. As as you can see, this one's green, this one here is blue. If I double click on this, it's going to follow the tangential path which precedes it. So as I change this point over here, it's going to change this angle. So this will always remain on the tangent of that path. This comes into handy just to create smoother curves and helps you be a bit more precise. So I'm going to make a note of that as well. I'm not exactly sure if a tangent handle is the very precise terminology for it, but that's what I'm going to call it for now. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my side bearing here just so I can get a more centered preview here. And the side bearings was just the actual sides of the glyph. But since we're doing a lettering piece, I don't know if it's appropriate to call this actually a glyph. So I'm going to go through here now and just sort of fix up some of my curves. And this is where I'm going to start to highlight a few plugins that I use. Because as I was doing this, I wasn't being super precise in exactly how I was doing it. I was getting angled handles, and it was very messy. So one thing I'm going to highlight right now is the Show Angled Handles plugin. So the Show Angled Handles plugin comes in handy because you sort of, it highlights which handles are just slightly off axis, or if you have straight lines that aren't quite, that are like, it almost appears like they're supposed to be perfectly straight, but they're not. And so each one of these ones with a red node on the end of it, sort of signifying that it's not perfectly straight. These don't, because they are perfectly straight. So I can sort of just adjust this, hold shift, and it'll give me a straight angle on it. So I can do all that really quick and just sort of tighten everything up. And you can see in this path here that it's not, you know, a tangent handle, meaning these two are sort of disconnected. So I'm going to double click that just to ensure that I get a smooth transition between here every time. I'm going to add that over here now because I didn't earlier. So that is, the plugin is called Show Angled Handles. Let me just double check that. View, Show Angled Handles, yes. So that's another great plugin, just to make sure you're sort of getting everything as cleaned up as you can. So now I can actually go through, and obviously this isn't looking good. So I can start to make sure things are working, lined up where they need to be, correct some of these angles. And so I know these two are in relatively good spots to work with. They're pretty much at the extrema there. And so I can select both of these. If I select the handle as well, you sort of start to see, if I select both of these handles, it sort of highlights this path so you know exactly what you're working with here. And just to sort of speed things up to where I'm not like dragging every single handle, I'll come over here to the fit curve. This is a sort of helps adjust some of your angles, so it does 60 to 80%. You can change those to however you want. Every so often, so in here it's making it too tight even though I'm at the lowest. And if I go higher, it's obviously going to be a tighter curve. So I can adjust this, make it 40 for the sake of this lettering piece that I'm working on, because that might start to help out. And you know, just sort of get a bit of a smoother curve here. We're not going to rely on this entirely. It's just more so to get the ball rolling and get things looking a bit nicer. And so I'm going to just go through and get all these set up. So before I sort of leave you off, one thing I want to highlight really quick is right now I know this point right here needs to be higher up. And while I could drag it and move it myself, I'm going to move that sort of moves each handle with it. Instead, one of the things I really like about Glyphs is that I can keep those two stationary if I hold down the Option key and drag upwards. So if I have this handle or this anchor point here selected and hold the Option key, I can then move just the anchor, keep the handle stationary, and sort of smooth out that curve. This comes into handy just to get smoother tangents, because if I were to have kept this really low, you can see down in the bottom that I'm sort of getting a strange kink here. So I know that I need to move it up. And you can see the same is sort of happening down in the lower left as well, and that's why I like having this preview here, because then I know that I can sort of scoot this up a little bit and it's already getting smoother. So now I'm just going to go through, I'm going to make a note of that as well. I'm going to put that in the shortcuts and tricks because I think that's a bit more important than some of the other ones. So we'll call that Shift anchor point. Oops. Hold Option and nudge point. So keep that in mind whenever you're going through here. This, if you start dabbling with it, holding the Option key and nudging is probably the most used feature I use in Glyphs. It's just sort of become second nature now, and I try to do it in Illustrator all the time, and then I realize I can't. And that's one of the reasons why I'm almost always pushed back over to Glyphs. It's because that feature is not in Illustrator. And it really just comes in handy, especially when you're working with type, just to make small refinements and just speed things up. So now I'm just going to keep going through here and, oops, and get everything set up. Alright, so this is slowly starting to get somewhere. And I say slowly, although there was only about a couple minutes worth of work there. But again, I've just sort of moved from a phase of really rough to just slightly tuning things up, and it's just going to keep continuing that of making tiny refinements and getting this to where it needs to be. And so I'm going to add in sort of this tittle here for the eye. I'm just using a perfect circle for it at the moment. This will be slightly adjusted afterwards. And I'm not even totally happy with the position of it, but we're just going to keep it where it's at for now. And I sort of want to highlight some other aspects of what I was doing and sort of why exactly certain decisions were made. First off, when I went in, I didn't set up any guides. I almost never really set up any guides to begin with. I wasn't too concerned with the angles. It was more so just sort of getting it in there and getting started. I'll sort of add some guides later and just to keep things in line. But for the most part, everything is done more so optically. If it looks right, then it probably is right, versus it being so calculated that it then sort of loses some of its spirit. So one thing I do want to highlight though right now is this sort of intersection here. The reason this is occurring is because, and this is being sort of knocked out in the center, is because Glyphs focuses on path direction. And so if I look at this circle here, the path direction is sort of going counterclockwise. And if I were to add another circle in here, and it's going counterclockwise again, nothing sort of happens to it. If I were to right click on this and reverse the selected contours, it's now going clockwise, and you can see that it was knocked out. The sort of same thing is happening here. And an easy way to fix that is you can either double click on what you need and right click and then reverse the selected contours, or select everything, hold Shift+Command+R, and that will sort of fix all of those. And what that does is correct path direction. So I'm going to add that here as well. So correct path direction. And that is Shift plus Command plus R. So these angles aren't the exact same, and we'll sort of address how to get some of those fixed later. I didn't just draw a box in there because who knows, as I go I might decide that I actually want them to be a little bit different. But one thing I want to highlight again is why I was doing these overlaps instead of doing just a single point down in this area. The reason for that is it allows me greater flexibility over both angles here. So when I have just this single one, anytime I want to adjust where this might be entering, I'm forced to adjust this angle as well. And by having the overlap, I'm sort of separating the way in which those two operate, and I can isolate and adjust one at a time. So now I'm just adjusting that downstroke. So that comes in handy, and can really just gives you greater control over stuff. You can do the exact same thing in Illustrator. So from here, we're going to actually start refining some things and get them to a position that I like. I'm at a point now where I have it roughed in. I have my sketch and I like the sketch, but usually when I get to this point and I have a general idea of what I'm doing, I have all the shapes in, I know sort of where it needs to go from here. I like to delete the image and just focus on the vector itself. Because if I become too focused on the sketch, then I'm going to sort of work everything around the sketch and not how the vector should actually end up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy this layer, and I'm going to make a change real quick just so you can see how that sort of worked. If I make a change here, you've got the tittle sort of shooting out to the side now. And I go back, I just copied it earlier, so now I have the tittle back to normal. And the way I use layers and glyphs is sort of as an archive, a way to sort of document what I was just working on. So I'll go back to my regular layer. This is always the active one. And I'll continue to make changes here. If I make a major change, I might duplicate it again, just so I have it in the archive and can go back to reference it. It can be helpful just to track little changes and see what progress was made. And if you want to experiment with something, that's a great way to do it as well, because then you can just toggle between both layers and see what was actually working better. So I have a new layer. I'm going to go ahead, unlock my image, and delete it. So now I can actually just focus on the lettering itself. So to get started, I'm going to sort of equalize a little bit of the angles happening here. This angle, this angle, this angle, this angle, this angle, they're all sort of different. And sometimes consistency, like too much consistency can be boring. But in this case, I'm going to start with just sort of equalizing them a bit, making them all at the same angle, and then we might make some adjustments from there depending on what actually looks good. So I'm trying to decide which angle I like the most. I feel like I like this one on the right side of the U here. So I'm going to select the angle, these two anchor points here. I'm going to right click and hit add guideline. What's great about that is if I hit add guideline, it adds a guideline at that angle of the point selected. So if I were to do one here, it's going to do the same thing of a guideline shooting up in that direction. So you can select the guideline by selecting the little circular handle in the center of it to then move it around and do what you need to with it. And what's good with this is that you can then move it if needed, and you can sort of undo those changes as well. And so I'm going to take this handle, or this guide here, and you can also duplicate it by holding Option and clicking and dragging away from it. It's not necessary, and so in this case I'm just going to kind of just focus on having one. And I'm going to then sort of match some of these angles. And you can see that I got an extra diamond behind there whenever I brought it up. That was because it was indicating that it actually sits on the guideline, or at least approximately really close. I'm going to zoom in just so you can get an idea of like why I said approximates. Because Glyphs is a type design software. Everything is sort of structured around a grid of some sort. In this case, it's a very, very fine grid. And it'll be, Glyphs sort of defaults it to 1,000. So that's almost like in 1,000 by 1,000, it's 1 pixel from my understanding, 1,000 points. So when I said approximate, it's not exactly on the guideline, but it's close enough. Again, this is all visual and optical, and so I'm not going to sweat over it like you might in Illustrator, where you can get fractions of points, just because it's not necessary. And that's one thing I really like about Glyphs as well. It sort of forces you to loosen up and focus more so on the optics versus the calculated methods of everything. So I'm just going to continue along here, and this is an instance where I accidentally dragged the angle of the guide. This happens fairly frequently if you're not zoomed in enough. So I can undo that, get it back, zoom in to make sure I'm actually selecting the point I want to move, and get it on there. Okay, so I have, but now let's get this one as well. So those are all at the same angle. I might do the same with these ink traps. I call them ink traps, although they're more so a stylistic feature than an actual functioning ink trap. And I want to do something similar with these ones. So I'm going to sort of bring my guide over there, drag it to match this angle. And I like this one. It's not the exact same as what I was doing for the tops, but I like the sort of subtle contrast of that. So let's adjust these now. Alrighty, I got all those sort of lined up, deleted my guide because I don't really need it anymore. I'm going to sort of go back to the method of quote-unquote winging it and just sort of seeing what feels and looks right versus exactly being on a guideline. But for the sake of it, I may as well equalize these two. Okay, so we're going to keep on moving along here. You'll notice that I didn't add a point at these extremes here. The reason being, I often have difficulty with it being so shallow to get a really smooth transition here. I may decide against that later on as I go to see if I want to actually add it in there. But considering these 2 points are fairly close, it can often just be difficult to get this to feel right, for this to have an extreme point here and then one up here, to get that just to actually transition smoothly. So we're going to go in here and just continue poking around and seeing what's working. Just to start, I want to highlight another plugin that I think will come in handy, that I'm still getting used to and sort of figuring out for myself, but I want to showcase. Before going into that one, I'm gonna showcase or tell you about one that I use regularly. So I'm gonna take everything in the background because I'm gonna be making a bunch of adjustments to this. I can use my past layer to use as a reference, but In Glyphs, what I like about it is that you have a background layer, and you can hit Command+B to get to that. That's automatically on every single one. So I'm going to add that in the shortcuts and tricks here. So you can toggle back and forth using Command+B. If you select everything, you can hit Command+J. That's going to take everything I have selected and send it to the background. Previously there's nothing here because it was just an empty background layer. But by doing Command+J on the foreground, it sends everything, or at least duplicates everything, to the background layer as well. The reason I'm doing this is because as I make adjustments here, I'm going to maybe want to have some reference points, and it can also help for just sort of aligning things, because whatever I have in this background, I have a plugin called Show Handles Everywhere. And what's great about that is if I have something in the background, let's say this handle for instance, and I really like it over here, and perhaps I copied that from another layer. As I'm on the foreground, I also see that over here, and I can match it very easily. So I'm going to add that to the plugins as well. Show Handles Everywhere. And so these two are free that I have listed so far. Glyphs has a lot of free plugins, and you can sort of go to glyphsapp.com/extend. So I'll write that here. glyphsapp.com/extend. And you'll be able to see a lot of the plugins. In Glyphs itself as well, you can go to the plugin manager, and you can see all of the apps they have here, or not apps, the plugins. And you can get a grasp for everything that they've got that's free, and they might even have some trials for some of the ones that I might show here in a minute. Installed, you can see all the ones that I've got here. A lot of them come in handy. Heat map sort of shows the density of everything, so you can sort of visualize the thickness. Inflections, you can sort of see on this S how it's inserting that point, and a lot of other great ones. I suggest checking out their website, and you can sort of see bigger descriptions and actually get a grasp of how each one works. I'm not going to use all of these here today because a lot of them are pretty type design specific and not necessary for what we're doing. So we're going to keep on going here, and what I want to bring up next is this little icon here. This is called SuperTool, and that's another plugin I'm using. I'm going to open up Safari and sort of show you exactly what that is. So this is SuperTool. It gives a visualization of curvature, allows you to harmonize some of your curves, balance the handles, simplify complicated paths, and also visualize your thickness in your curves as well as your just stems and everything like that. This is 50 euros, so it ends up being about 60 something dollars. Which is definitely it's a great price for everything that you're getting. I've only had this for a few days now. I've used the sort of curvature visualization and the curve harmonization a ton, along with this sort of balancing handles. Comes in handy. It's not necessary, but again, I'm going to sort of showcase how it can speed things up. So I will write the link to here as well into the and the way I get SuperTool active is, of course, I can click on it. The shortcut would be U. And you can start to see that not everything is sort of working out quite as smooth as it could be. And the way I know that is by, if I go down to this one, you can see it's pretty close between these two curvatures. There's just a very, very small break. But if I were to go to this one, you can see that there's a very large break in between these two. That indicates that there's sort of a break in how smoothly these two transition into one another. And so I can select multiple points here, right click and hit harmonize. And you can see that it helped out this one, and this one. However, this one is not working out quite so good. And to sort of see it coming more into play, and you can see this bulge happening because it's becoming a very sharp corner here. And you'll see these start to adjust based on where this anchor is in relation to the curves that it's creating. So as I shift this over, you can start to see how the two start to meet up. And so I kind of want to get it as close as I can to help create a smoother curve. This is nice, but this is becoming a bit sharper than what I wanted originally. So I'm going to start to bring this back because I know that these two are sort of transitioning now based on these bezier handles. And so I could sort of tuck it back and get it to where I need it. And I'm getting a good idea of what my original was because I have it in the background layer here, and I can toggle between the two. So it's already starting to get a little bit smoother, and I'm going to allow SuperTool to, do a lot of work and start to balance some things out. Just make sure that the tensions are a lot smoother than where they were at earlier. So I'm going to zoom in here just so you can start to see how this is beginning to equalize a bit more. And now they're virtually transitioning into each other perfectly there. So one thing I can start to do here is to work on getting a few of these a bit more, just to see if, set up some guides to see how these angles are looking, as well as see what these sort of distances are starting to look like. And so I'm just kind of eyeballing a little bit, but I like this. And so I'm just kind of looking at it more so than setting them up themselves. But for the most part, they look pretty good. I think this eye should sort of kick over a little bit if it can. But I think this will come more so in handy with the E because this is the more rounder of the letters, and you can see it's sitting more horizontal than it is at this angle. So I'll sort of keep this over here just for now. And I'm going to go back over here, create a guideline for this sort of cross section. And here, if you click on the ruler, you can see that it becomes a guide that measures across everything. So this will come in handy if I want to see, the stem width, because it's not really reliable to measure straight across. And so ways of measuring, I'm going to make a note of that here. All right, measuring. And two ways you sort of go about that is, as you see here, I'm selected the ruler icon, and the shortcut for that is L. So ruler, I'll make L there. And that's just click and drag method. And so if you have the ruler selected, you click and drag, you can start to measure across things. This forces you to, and if you hold shift, you can go vertical or horizontal. But with angled letters like this, you want to go kind of perpendicular so that you know what you're actually with versus what it's what the skewed width is at. So one method is ruler, click and drag. The other method is actually creating a guideline and converting it to a ruler itself. So you create guideline and select ruler icon in the bottom left. So this comes in handy just because I know this is at the same angle as this, and gives me just a little bit of consistency in terms of how I'm going about measuring it. And of all of these sort of ink traps here, the ones I'm drawn to most are in the U, in the second half of the U, and entering the I. They're a bit narrower than, say, the T in this first one here. This one is far too wide. And so if I go in here and look how wide this one is, it's about 11 units versus the previous one, which was 16. The T is actually narrower, but it's sort of appearing that way because this is a less harsh angle than this one here. And the I is just shy of 11 as well. So that's sort of what I'll aim for with this one over here. And I'm going to just move this over so I'm starting to get a bit closer. And this can scoot over as well. So the background, at this point, it's sort of becoming more of a distraction than anything else. So I'm going to just go ahead and just delete it because it's not really doing anything of use at the moment. And the same thing sort of goes with these angled handles. I don't necessarily need them toggled on right now, so I'm just going to disable them. Here's a good example of how I might actually utilize that background layer. I kind of want to get a gauge for the width between these two, between the tops of this U here. So I'm going to copy this, go to the background, and paste it. And that'll sort of allow me to get a look at the actual differences here. And so if I wanted to perfectly match it, I could just drag this over, and I know that it perfectly matches. Optically looking at it, I think it looks too heavy, mostly because this ink trap isn't going to shoot all the way up as high as it is here. So it's not necessary. It's just more so to get a gauge on where I am in relation to it. And you can use that for all sorts of things. In this case, just being one small detail. But it can be great for getting a bit more consistency across letter forms, especially say if you were to be working on a logo type that is a script and you're utilizing a lot of elements that are going to be consistent across. Since this area feels, since it's a lot closer to the open space, I'm allowing this to become a bit narrower than, say, this one, because with this one being up so high and surrounded by such darkness, it's sort of making it feel a bit shallower, I suppose. And so for these ones, I'll probably go closer to 10 units just because they're sitting closer to all this open negative space. So another thing with the tangent angles is similar to what I was telling you earlier about how you can shift the anchor point between the handles by holding the Option. You can also do that on these sort of tangent points as well. It'll allow me to shift within that angle that it's already at. So this comes in handy too whenever something is too shallow or too deep. In this case, I want to make it go a little bit deeper, just to get a smoother transition, and then I can adjust this handle as well. So I'm just going to make an adjustment to this tittle here before I forget to later. One, I wanted to sort of scoot it closer. I want it to feel really tight in here, and sort of see how I can get that to balance. So I sort of want to come in here though and adjust the E, because what I was saying earlier is that this is sitting more as though we're just on a flat baseline versus sort of being at this angled here. The way this exit stroke is sort of helping it a bit, but really I just want to skew it a bit more. And that's what's great. You have some controls over here. I can scale things depending on the percentage that I want. So I just scaled it down 8%, scale it up 8%, and I can change that however I want. The same goes with the rotation. I can rotate it. You know, I have it at 1 degree because I'm usually working in small increments here, just very, very small things. But what I actually want to probably go in and try to mess with is skewing. So I'm going to bring it up just a little bit, and I just skewed it the opposite way of what I wanted. I want to lean forward a bit more, and so I did it twice, so that's 4 degrees, and that's probably getting a little too much. I'm going to go back to just the 2, and I think that's I think that might be appropriate for now. And we'll make some adjustments to the curves itself to make sure they're fine. One thing to be wary of is if you're skewing things along this axis, of course the horizontal ones are going to be fine, but it's the vertical ones that are going to start to get messed up. And so I can go to show angled handles, and I can see that one of these got messed up. So I scoot it back over, that's fine. Fix this one, fine, and fix that one. So that's just something to keep in mind. And you can toggle that by hitting Command+Y. From here, I'm going to sort of utilize that background layer thing again. I can probably get rid of this guideline now. Or actually, I'll keep it for the time being. I'll just sort of drag it off to the side. Sometimes it's nice to have it off just so you know exactly where you can grab it from. Sometimes if you have a measuring line, it can be just hard to see where exactly this circle point is. So one thing I want to utilize is I like the relative consistency between each of these ink traps. Obviously here it's getting messed up. It's becoming too close to the edge. So I'm just going to take all of this. This is sort of the part that I'm focusing on where I want to get a little bit more consistency, and just copy it. Well, I'll just do Command+J, send it into the background, and I'm just going to drag this up and go over here. So I can start to get a gauge on, you know, I can see that, say if I want to bring some more consistency between, you know, this drop, the eye, I can then make those adjustments. I can sort of bring this down, get this a little closer, and really I could have copied all of these and brought them over. I'm not too concerned about making it ultra consistent. Largely just sort of want to go through and showcase a few things. So I have that in the background. I can see what I'm sort of working with, and I know that it's probably going to shoot up way too high for what I'm trying to accomplish here. I'm just going to shoot up all the way up to where this is curling back in, and that's probably too much. And so I can work a bit more relative, bring it down and see where it needs to be. I probably need to tuck in a little bit more than where I had it before, just to make sure that this E isn't getting too far away. Although I'll scoot it over just a few units because it probably can use a little bit of help, or at least move a smidge further away. So I'm just going to match this ink trap now, line everything up, and so that I know for sure I've got a bit of consistency there. So now I want to get this a little bit thinner. It's a bit thicker than what I had on the other connections, so I can sort of start to bring that in, get it to a bit more of an appropriate spot. And what I'll probably do now is showcase the Insert Inflections plugin, because this is nice having just these 2 points, because I can adjust both of them and sort of gain a lot of control. But sometimes if you have really tight turns or tight curves, it doesn't work quite how you anticipate. So I can go to Filter, Insert Inflections, and it's going to insert that inflection here. And the inflection is sort of like that middle point between the tension of these 2 curves. So it's not exactly in the, it's not necessarily equidistant from one another, and more so relies on the curve angle. So I have that in here because then I can just sort of scoot this individually, focus on these 2 curves versus doing them all as just 2 handles. I gain a little bit more control by inserting that inflection there, because one curve might be a little bit slower, such as this top one. And I'm going to add that down here as well, just so you know what that is. Insert inflections. I think it's insert inflections. Let me just double check. Insert inflections, yep. And this one is free as well. And so with this E, things are getting a little bit more complicated. Things are sort of tucking into each other. I'm going to try to use the SuperTool, but I'm using such shallow curves that it's probably not going to utilize all that much. As you can see, these interior curves, virtually impossible to sort of actually utilize the tool because it's getting so tight. It's just sort of, it's becoming so tight that the curves are, the visualization is just abstracting itself. But some of these other ones, it can come in handy. But again, it's still so tight that I can't even get it exactly where it needs to be. And that's fine. And this is more so just to get a starting point of where things might go versus making sure it's actually 100% perfect. And this is a great example of how you can tell what the tool is doing. There's like this super strange kink happening here where you got this smooth transition and then it just sort of juts out here. It feels a lot more horizontal. And you're sort of seeing how drastic that break is. And I can start to smooth it out just by bringing this off to the left. And it's a smoother transition along the bottom, but not quite what we're looking for. I kind of want this to be a tad sharper, so some of those adjustments will be done on the other side of the curve itself. And I can just kind of scoot this over, grab these, and make some adjustments. So that's probably a little too much. We'll drop that back down. It's getting close to where it should be. And yeah, we're getting a lot smoother here. I'm just going to kind of zoom out to everything just to get a gauge. I'm going to delete what's in the background here. It's not super necessary anymore. And the reason I want to zoom out here is so we can sort of toggle between where we were at earlier and where we're at now. You can sort of see things starting to tighten up and just look a lot better overall. So you can go back in here and start to smoothen up a few of these. So if I came in here and decided that I actually wanted to gain a bit more control over some of these areas, which I kind of do actually, I'm not really satisfied with this inside curve here and that I want to add the extrema. What I can do is sort of double click on here, to where the paths are actually selected, and to add extremes, and that's going to insert those there. I'm going to copy everything. The reason I'm doing that is because I added some extremes where I don't necessarily want them. So I added in all these vertical areas, which is good to have. But in the case of this piece, it's not necessary. I'm getting a perfectly smooth curve with just these 2 points here, whereas that before. In fact, it's not having to adhere to a grid by having a point or by not having a point there. So it's arguably smoother. But in this case, I want those there. So the reason I copied that is so I can throw it back in the background here. So I can then come in here and just sort of place some points just to match up with them. So I've now got my extremes in here. And you could just as easily eyeball it and find it and just then make sure that these are actually straight. But so this one is probably fine. I might sort of add a little more kick in there just to make it feel like it's actually curving in a bit more. And with this one, I might bring this in a bit more, maybe bring it up, sort of make that slight reverse contrast a bit more evident, and make it a little less evident here. But then start to just make some little adjustments and see what I can get this to do. So that's pretty rough, or it's getting into a good position here. I'm not like 100% convinced or like fully satisfied by the entire thing, but it definitely got somewhere, and really didn't spend much time on this at all. And of course I'm sort of walking through, trying to talk about things and remember everything I wanted to touch on prior as I go through, so that sort of slows things down a bit. But for the most part, it was fairly quick. I got a lot of precision control out of it that I hope you got to sort of see as well. Some things, if I were to come back in here, or as I do come back in here and sort of touch up and look at, are little things like just getting a bit more consistency in the width of these sort of downstrokes here. This T feels especially narrow in this area. I'm liking how the I is, but then also sort of touching up some of the negative space. If I go over here and click on this sort of black and white circle, it's going to invert it. And that might help make it a bit more evident here. This sort of negative space in some of these, I think, are feeling a bit too large or too open at the end here compared to this one in the T and the U, as well as the C entering into it. Perhaps a little too open, and see what I could do to sort of close those up a little bit in that section and see where it goes from there. But I also sort of just want to showcase a few more things before I close out here of just things in Glyphs that come in handy. I can toggle that back and forth. I can flip this upside down and also see that. And so upside down, I see it a lot more in terms of that consistency. Feeling a lot more open here at the I and the E. This is great because then you can also visualize some of your thicknesses. It sort of abstracts it to an extent to help you balance sort of your letter forms. So I'll flip this back over. And another thing, again, this is a type design software, so a lot of these are type specific, but they come in handy for lettering. A lot of it translates, so I can blur this, so it sort of simulates it at a further distance or a smaller size, and this is going to sort of give us an idea of what that white space looks like. And so in the U, obviously it's tighter than in between individual letters. the I and the E, sort of that counter there, virtually disappears. And you can see it disappearing pretty quickly. That's just because we have such a narrow connection here. And I don't have to be too concerned with this. This is just, a fun lettering piece. But if I were to be working on a logo type, this definitely comes in handy because I know how easily things are going to collapse at smaller scale or from a distance, or if it's printed on bad quality or ends up being blurry. So having this feature of being able to quickly preview what you're doing at a smaller scale or blurry, upside down, inverted, things like that really comes in handy. And will just sort of improve, or can help improve the way in which you work, and just make sure that you're creating logo types and lettering pieces that are a bit more appropriate and bulletproof for the situations that they're intended for. So just a few other things that aren't necessary or aren't really applicable for this example of what I'm doing, but are good to know, is say I were working on a lettering piece that I needed things to be pretty darn consistent. I can select 2 points here, and it's going to show me the width and the height between those 2 points. Same thing happens with handles. And so if I wanted all the verticals to be the same, I can quickly see what that is, make note of it, and sort of get that consistent across letter forms. Another thing that's a plugin that I wanted to show was the heat map. Heat map is great because this sort of helps again with the weight distribution. This is going to take a minute just because it's so large. It's used to doing it on like a single letter form. And I question if I'm going to get a good reading on it just because this tittle is so massive. So it's probably going to skew things a little bit. Maybe if I delete this, I can get a better reading. To an extent, and it's probably still kind of loading as well. It feels far more pixelated than it normally is, especially while I'm doing a screen recording and trying to use heat map. It's probably going to make my computer explode. But this is nice because it sort of gives you a visualization. It's almost like topography, in that it gives a visualization of the actual weight there. So I'm going to toggle that off. That would be more come in handy if you're working on something that was monoline or just mono width, or not mono width, just low contrast. So I can toggle that off, bring back my tittle, and we've got our little Cutie lettering piece here. So I'm probably going to continue going through, making small refinements, touching things up, maybe experiment a little bit, see what it looks like if it were more reverse contrast, see if it were less. And as I go along, I'll probably copy the layers. I'll do that now just so I have it. And I'll have a sort of graveyard, per se, of past versions that I can go back and reference and just sort of see the progress as well. So this is Glyphs. I'm going to make another note of heat map. Maybe I'll do another one and show how that comes in handy. But if you have any questions, are interested in learning more about how these things you can do in Glyphs, if anything I went over is sort of hazy or confusing, or just want some clarification on, or if you're encountering like a specific problem, feel free to let me know. You can message me on Instagram or Twitter, shoot me an email, hello@mattymatt.co, leave a comment on this video, and yeah, I'll try to maybe do some more of these videos and just showcase a bit of what Glyphs has to offer and what you can actually accomplish with it. So hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions, or if you want to see other things, or if you want something elaborated on, just let me know. Thanks.